Hey everyone, Eric Watson here, freelance writer, player of games, writer of words, recorder of videos, and tabletop role-playing aficionado. Welcome to another DM's Guild review, my written and video review series. Take a look at the adventures and supplemental material at the Dungeon Masters Guild website. This video will be reviewing the Monster Supplement Monster Perks, designed by Chad M. Lensch and Blaise Wigglesworth for Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. A review copy has been provided for the purposes of this review. If you enjoy my content, consider using my affiliate links for online shopping and supporting me via patreon.com/RogueWatson. Monster Perks are templates that you can use with any existing 5th edition monster. They provide 10 different templates that are all themed around some kind of mutation or just being undead or whatever else. And each of these templates has a minion version as well as a stronger mini-boss version, and then technically you can take that mini-boss version and make it a boss version by giving it an even extra ability on top of that. And the first couple of rules are just all about how to create these templates, how to utilize them. They're pretty effective, they're pretty simple to follow, which I very much appreciate. It uses the encounter breakdown rules from the Dungeon Master's Guide in terms of how to build encounters by scaling, the number of creatures and using their CR rating and having the XP budget you've got for encounter. I have mixed feelings about relying. I mean, I do it obviously when I'm reviewing. I look at CR ratings and stuff, but it's something that you learn after playing D&D 5th edition for years and years, that sometimes the CRs can be a little wonky. The monster designs can be a little weird when it comes to trying to actually balance. But if we assume all of that is working by design, then I think this does a really effective way of adding new abilities without adding new monsters, and is also a really effective way to counter metagaming, which is something that you can run into with a lot of veteran players that, they've all fought goblins, they've fought, owlbears and manticores and gelatinous cubes and whatever else, and they kind of just know, maybe they don't try not to have their character make those kind of mistakes, but and know that kind of knowledge, but it's hard to divorce yourself from that kind of information. So this is a really fun way to take existing creatures and then apply different kinds of traits, as well as pretty effectively tell a story with all that. So if you want to have like a forest full of swampy creatures, then you can totally do that and use the putrescent template and have this evil swamp that has turned them all into undead ooze creatures. And that maybe, or you could create a forest full of spiny creatures, and there's some druid who's casting some kind of spell that's making all the animals have that trait. So it's an effective way of building zones and areas that are all themed around certain effects, and you can again use any base creature for doing any of these templates, which I think is a really cool add and a good solution to just the usual adding of new monsters. That's something I see a lot of. I like it. I like new monsters. I like new stat blocks. That's a lot of fun, but this can be a lot more flexible because you can simply take any monster and add these templates on top of it. So there's 10 of these templates, and each one of them includes 2 different stat block upscaling that you can do. You can take the base minion type, which is a +1 in terms of taking whatever its base CR and raising it to the next level. In other words, like a 1/8 would go, a 1/8 CR would go to like 1/4, for example, or a 1 would go to a 2. That's essentially what it does for the difficulty, and it adds new actions. So everybody that's part of this theme has new traits. We're actually going to skip ahead to, what's a good one to look at? Let's look at Prehensile Tailed. So in this case, everybody who's a prehensile tail creature gains advantage on dexterity saving throws because they've got balance from their tail. And they have proficiency in performance and sleight of hand. And then the Blitzer is what's called for the minion one, which again, you take any base creature, you up its CR by 1. And it adds the clutching tail trait, which means it can wield an extra object or weapon or shield in its prehensile tail. It does have disadvantage when attacking if it has a weapon there, as well as if it doesn't have anything in its tail, it has advantage on grapple attacks. And then you take the Stinger, which is the base monster plus 2 CR, and you grant it a stinging attack for its tail. So now it's actually got like a barbed, scorpion type tail, which thankfully all of these templates include scaling attacks or saving throws or spells or whatever, depending on what the creature's ability is. Because, again, you can use any base CR creature to use any of these things. And sometimes it's by size and sometimes it's by CR. So that's a really cool, tables that the designers have provided because they know that, I could use anything from a goblin to a Balor or something if I wanted to. And then on top of that, you could use the boss, what's called a boss synergy, which is a specific, typically an action that just the boss can do. And what I took it to this mean is that you have your CR plus ones, which are your kind of foot soldiers, minions, your CR plus two, which are your more powerful, maybe you only have one or two of those in a fight, and maybe it mentions earlier in the kind of ways to use this thing, maybe you just introduce minions first, and then in the next encounter you might have a plus two boss after that. But even then you could divorce them and just have it be like, stronger versions, and then if you want a singular literal boss of this faction, then you give them this extra action, which in this case for the Prehensile Tails, they can take their own allies and toss them at enemies or in the backline or something, which is pretty funny. Also, each of these templates includes a tactics section, which I'm very appreciative of. I love it whenever encounters tell me how best to run that encounter. Even though I have a lot of experience running encounters, it's not something I'm necessarily great at. So I really appreciate that, even though most of the tactics are pretty obvious. So if there's, abilities that debuff the players, for example, it's like, you should use that ability first. Like, yeah, okay. It's pretty obvious stuff, but still, I like having tactics there. It's very helpful. It's very nice to see. And because we're getting a lot of new abilities, it's nice to see how to incorporate those abilities into actually running them. For the illusionists, this is an example of one that's not a physical trait, but one that is more people just really good at casting spells, and you literally just give them spell casting. Essentially, you give them innate spell casting. They can cast blur and invisibility. And again, the tactics basically say, hey, if it's before a fight, cast invisibility so they can ambush, and if the fight's already happening, they can cast blur so that you have disadvantage on them. The lower illusion warriors have spells, but it's interesting because they're limited to evocation and conjuration spells, and they're at reduced power because they are. So instead of, you think you're fighting against illusionists, they're literally casting illusion spells. That's not necessarily the case. Instead, they're casting like shadow versions of basically more useful spells for enemies to cast, because I don't think illusion is something enemies can cast fairly effectively in combat versus just casting, magic missile and burning hands and all that. But in this case, they're like shadow versions, so they're reduced effectiveness. I think the players get an additional DC to make a save, or they can conjure different creatures or animals or elementals, but they're shadow versions of the conjuration, so they only have half the hit points that they normally would have. So that's a pretty cool compromise. And then the boss just has basically better spells. Also, something that works really well with the synergy between the bosses and the minions is a lot of them have AoE abilities that are specifically, the minions are immune to like the boss's AoE abilities, which I like to see. Either it's, spells, or it's poison, or it's necrotic damage, or it's whatever is happening. They're usually immune to each other's abilities, so that way they can use them indiscriminately as AoE attacks. Putrescent is really awesome. It's a combination of undead and ooze. All the putrescent creatures gain damage resistances, immunities, and condition immunities. They've got the ooze amorphousness. They kind of turn into gelatinous cubes because they've got this like oversized large mouth that they can bite people, which restrains and grapples them, and then they can use another action to swallow the creature, which then does acid damage. So kind of turns every creature into a gelatinous cube. However, things get really interesting when you look at the boss stuff that's here. There is an exploder, which if you have played like Left 4 Dead and had the big boomer, which was the big fat guy that just explodes. I mean, Diablo 2 had enemies like this. Basically just a classic enemy that when you hit them, they explode. I think there might have been a bit of confusion here because this one states that as soon as you hit them, they explode and do their ability. But then the synergies say, hey, wait until their death is imminent to make your move. I was like, well, wait a minute. These... so it only happens when they're supposed to die. Was a little bit of confusion there, but anyway, as soon as you attack them, the reaction is to explode into this disease bomb, which does damage. It reduces hit points if you fail a save, and it heals the other putrescent creatures. So you specifically don't want to target this creature, which is stronger than the other creatures, which is fascinating. And obviously the tactics are you want to keep it with the others. And then the boss synergy, you can have a really nasty one that has all of those abilities. Plus, whenever any putrescent dies, it becomes a lump. And if there's a boss nearby, the lumps literally crawl towards the boss, and the boss can use a bonus action to absorb these lumps. And then if it absorbs a certain amount of lumps, it can spawn new putrescent creatures. That is an awesome feature that adds a whole new dynamic to any kind of fight where you suddenly have these. You have to really think about like your tactics in terms of who are we killing where, how do we separate these enemies, like the first time you start seeing them. And it's a great example of how, you know, you fight the initial ones and they've got their whole thing, which can be kind of challenging with the bites and the swallows. And then you've got the explodey guys that you can, you know, encounter later that are suddenly, oh god, they're damaging us, they're healing people, that's also bad. And then you can introduce the boss, we're like, oh god, they're also absorbing all the dead bits and spawning new ones. Absolutely awesome. So this one, I think is probably the best example of adding new traits that just add really, really satisfyingly cool new abilities to any baseline creature. There's Undead Thralls, which you can, again, turn any creature into an undead, which I'm sure there's already tons of templates for that. In fact, I believe the original Monster Manual comes with a template for zombifying any creature. In this case, it gives all the undead pack tactics. I guess they can actually work together as thralls, because again, I guess they're supposed to be serving somebody. In this case, maybe the +2 master. They also all gain a bite attack, and for the +1 Vile Parasite, which is the minion version, with their bite attack, they can reduce max hit points and heal themselves, which is always a bummer to fight against. The boss, using that same attack, instead of being able to heal, they charm enemies, which can be a very much pain in the ass. It's not a domination, but it's still, you regard them as kind of a buddy. Or you can just throw this like necrotic grenade into the enemy and into players, and that's another example of how all the undead thralls are immune to necrotic damage, so you can just indiscriminately lay that AoE down everywhere. And then the bosses can do a shriek that basically inflicts bane, which is a negative 1d4 on all the players. So I like this. It's pretty simple, but it's an effective way of tying all these creatures together. And I don't think it would necessarily make them that much harder to run. You're just taking whatever creatures you want, whether they're dogs, whether they're owl bears. Whether they're orcs, whatever, that they've got this nasty bite attack they can do all these horrible things, and then you can scale the creatures appropriately depending on what base you're using. That changes the damage, the saving throw, and all that information. Void Harbinger, I really appreciate that not all of these are physical traits, by the way, because that would have been a complaint of mine, and there's just enough here that it's not a complaint. With most of them being physical mutations. You've got the spined, you've got the prehensile tails, you've got the jumping guys, which are that's basically what they do, they just jump around. The burrowers, bestial ravagers are just kind of very good at like ambushing and attacking. All of those are kind of physical mutations versus, and even really the undead ones are technically physical mutations as well. So I really like the Astral Invaders and the Void Harbingers specifically because they're more about being tainted by some supernatural force, which I think is a good way of, again, foreshadowing like, hey, there's some, super evil or wrong thing at the middle of this area that's tainting all these people or has corrupted this group of people or creatures. Again, you could have creatures that are Void Harbingers or whatever. That's kind of what the creatures are in Divinity Original Sin 2, I think. In this case, the minions, when they die, they explode, which is always a fun trait because that's just free damage on the players. They also can cause, they can stun players and protect themselves with tentacles, which is not how I thought tentacles would work for them, but that's fine. The CR2 guys basically just do everything a little bit better. However, instead of stunning enemies, they instead inflict madness upon them. And it's not just the short-term madness table from the Dungeon Master's Guide. It's actually a unique D10 collapse Psyche table, which is all pretty much just bad stuff that is scaled towards happening in combat. And the boss can cause a mass confusion effect, which is also horrendously awful. So I really appreciate that not all of them are physical mutations, because I think that would limit this too much. I still think there was some room, and maybe this is for a whole second supplement, of maybe creatures that are marked by certain like gods in the Forgotten Realms universe, and maybe they have traits associated with those gods, or they're just worshippers that have been bestowed those traits. If they're sentient humanoids, I think that could be a really useful way to do monster perks and templates. But as it is, I think there's plenty of content here, and it's really, really good stuff on how to, just add on to existing, because right now we've got so many monsters available, and I really like the fact that this takes existing monsters and just gives them new abilities, and all the themes and abilities and traits work very, very well. We'll get to my one con, which I haven't come up with yet, but I'll explain as we get to my pros and cons. Right now, pros, 10 templates that grant any 5e monster new thematic abilities. I just mentioned that's the whole thing of the supplement. I think it's really good. Pro, each template includes minion and boss versions. Technically 3 versions, but really 2 because there's rules basically for 2, which is the +1 and the +2. The third one is just, hey, add on, the one boss you have has this one extra trait, which is still pretty effective and cool. And pro, detailed tactics on how to use each new ability and trait. They're not the, most necessarily the cleverest tactics, but there are some things and a few that maybe I wouldn't have realized. And frankly, it's just nice seeing. Like, I wish everything that gave me monsters gave me some little, don't have to be paragraphs and paragraphs, but just give me a few sentences on, hey, how do these creatures attack? What's their best tactics to use? And especially if you've got all this synergy working between bosses and minions, how do they best utilize each other in terms of their own abilities and staying near each other, or, one person grapples, the other person throws, or whatever's going on. That's really, really helpful to read. My con is that I think it would have been really helpful to list recommended candidates for each of these templates. For example, sample creatures that would have made prime candidates that either make sense thematically or their base stat blocks synergize well with the templates. And just an example, like obviously Bestial Ravagers kind of make sense for, beasts and monsters. However, it gives them pack tactics, so maybe ones that don't already have pack tactics, for example. And like for Spined, a big deal is that anybody who attacks them takes damage, and anybody that they are grappling or being grappled by takes damage because they're just covered in spines. So obviously melee creatures, and especially creatures who would be doing the grappling themselves, with whatever abilities means they have to do that, would make effective spined candidates. So I would have really liked to see a section that was like, recommended base monsters for this template would be this, and this. And even, you can use these from the monster manual, use these from, Volos and all that. I think that would have been a really cool ad. Hopefully not being too nitpicky, but that would have been really fun because I'm, going through here trying to come up with ideas for like, okay, which creatures, would this work well for? And I think it'd be really helpful for me to have some sample ideas for prime candidates. Final verdict, Monster Perks has simple and effective rules for upscaling any base 5e monster, along with 10 creatively interesting templates with new abilities, traits, and synergies. Thank you to everyone for watching this video review. You can see my written review at roguewatson.com. You can watch more reviews and follow our own D&D adventures here on my YouTube channel. You can support my work at patreon.com/roguewatson. Shouts to Platinum patrons Joe, Will, Tiny Dancer, Wizard, Princess, Christopher, Thomas, Captain Mike, Adam, Aiden, Stan, Nathan, Alex, Chad, Alexander, Dan, Cam, the Quizats, Hatterack, and Gold patrons RPG, Papercrafts, Pretty Boy, and Yuma, Dead Lizard, Lounge, Sam, Ross, Limpy Spuds, Jerome, Sklinia, Nick, Farty McButterpants, Blood Angel, Vernon, Baboon, Baboon, Nathan, Fast Like a Tortoise, and James. Thank you all very much for your support.